have the ability to get those answers from a human that's qualified and trained to help them.
Excellent. So you have joined. You were originally the co-founder of the company, and then you actually your background is in engineering. I believe at maybe at one point you were the CTO of the company too. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but you have
That's
worked
correct.
with this technology in the past, basically. I guess can you just tell us a little bit how did you start, and how, basically at what point did you decide to co-found AgentIQ and why?
Sure. So AgentIQ was initially started again with another person, and I was the CTO originally. And I came on really to build out the technology. We initially started with the idea of having AI boosted customer service platform, but as we started engaging with potential clients and scoping the market, we realized there's a bigger need in the market that is not being satisfied by many of the competitors, any of the solutions out there, and that is the need to have in digital space, in digital world, have the ability to develop and maintain relationships and to get kind of the high touch, high tech type of service that customers appreciate, but institutions even that they try to provide it don't have means to do it otherwise. And this was definitely not specific to financial institutions. And ultimately, I believe we are developing a new category of service, personalized digital service, that is going to become ubiquitous and available in lots of other verticals. But financial vertical was interesting because it is traditionally a relationship-based business, and relationships are key into setting up prosperity and various other benefits. But the traditional model is to some extent suffering because in-branch service, which was again the pillar of their traditional banking model, is being displaced by digital service. Customers like digital service because it's more convenient. It's available on their phones and their desktop computers,
Okay.
and it's great for simple transactional type of stuff. But they're losing by moving completely digital. They're losing the ability to really get answers to open-ended question, advice, and support when it comes to bigger questions. For example, you can imagine, let's say your spouse lost work because of COVID, and you're struggling to make mortgage payments. Currently, there's really no channel, no solution that allows you to ask those types of questions. But in a world where there is an existing relationship, you have a primary point of contact at your financial institutions. That's a natural place to ask questions of that sort, and ultimately get the advice. And we know that 60% or more of consumers act on advice they receive from a trusted source like their financial institution.
Okay, very interesting. And so based on your current offering or your product that's currently in the marketplace, obviously you said your primary target market are the financial institutions. Um, is it geared more towards the sort of the kind of larger institutions, basically like kind of multinationals, or do you have a specific market that you found is more, I guess, adaptable to your product versus others?
It's a great question. So we are primarily focusing on community uh, banks and credit unions, typically, institutions in size, half a billion, say 30 billion in size. And these are the institutions that have differentiated themselves not necessarily by kind of low margin, high volume type of transactional based business, but by providing that homey community feel and touch, and providing support for all of their customers in the community they live. And these are the customers that appreciate the ability to take the relationships they have developed in physical world and transfer them to digital world, and also add new ones.
Okay. And are you really, so you're basically found your company's headquartered in San Francisco. Have you, as an organization, went in through any like seed or venture rounds? Have you onboarded any investors over the last few years since you started this?
We certainly have. So we have several, prominent VC companies and financial institutions as investors, and we have raised a significant amount of money. Our lead investor is Sierra Ventures, which is
Okay.
a VC company that's been around for, I would say, probably about 50 years or so, uh, especially active in SaaS, kind of customer-centric types of solutions, and we are in smack center of that. So it was a very natural fit.
Got it. And what's for all the listeners, all the podcast members, if they want to reach out to you or your team, what would be the best way for them to inquire about your product?
Sure. I mean, most comprehensive place is probably our website,
Okay.
www.agentiq.com. But also anybody out there, feel free to reach out to me via email at Slaven, SLAVN, at agentiq.com. We do have a fairly active LinkedIn channel as well as a Twitter channel where we try to post updates and are happy to engage. But ultimately, probably the website is the best starting point.
Excellent. So to all the audience members, we will be posting this information on the description of this website. I'm sorry, of this podcast. So you'll be able to find the website and all the other information that Slaven just mentioned. Great. So maybe let's go back. So Slaven, that's an unusual name. What's your background? Where do you come from?
Well, thanks for asking. So I was born in Sarajevo, back when it was part of Yugoslavia. Currently that's in Bosnia, but I consider myself Croatian, and I've
Okay.
been living abroad for, I would say, large majority of my life, probably more than, what is it now, like 25 years plus outside, and about 16 or so plus in my hometown, in my home country. So
Got it. So I generally like, as you probably know, and the audience knows, this podcast is really centered around technology, startups, business, science. So most of the guests are really either in technology in some shape or form, or they're software engineers. So your background is software engineering. So when did you start programming?
um, so I started programming, when I was probably fifth or sixth grade. We got a Commodore 128K
Oh, wow.
of memory. And I remember, we got a few games also, but I got a book on basic programming, and I was trying to retype and create some of the games from that book. So it was like the first experience I had. The games did not work most of the time, but it was definitely fascinating and good to try. After that, when I moved to US, um, I get obviously more exposure, more access to computers, and have done a lot more work in high school as I was um, taking some bunch of electives and whatnot, including programming. And then I went to University of Washington where I did my computer science degree.
So that's interesting because you you beat me there because I started with Commodore 64. So you were you were better off.
Well,
Well,
one generation behind, I guess, because
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Commodore 64 came out probably like 2 or 3 years before
You
128.
had a lot more
So
processing power than I did.
yeah, all that memory, huh? Just to think of
Yeah,
100,
exactly.
128K.
Yep, yep. We used to do all kinds of stuff. So how did you did you I know there was obviously a war back in the 90s. Did you have any experience um with the war itself as a child or a teenager back in Bosnia in those days, or were you able to avoid it?
Sure. No, I definitely experienced it firsthand. The fighting kind of in my hometown started basically late March, and I spent the first 5 months in in Sarajevo. We were, surrounded by both sides, by all sides. It was very hard to leave the city. Uh, Very limited supply of food. I remember, eating basically same dish for like 1 month straight or something, and it was definitely not a lot of fun. But at that time, I was not 18 yet, so I was not obliged to join the military or anything like that. So ultimately, I decided to leave, and with some help from my parents and their friends, I was able to do so towards the end of July, and then I moved to Croatia, and I lived officially as a refugee with my relatives for about a year or so before
And where was
moving
this in
to.
Croatia?
This was in Labin in Istria, Croatia, very close,
Okay,
basically between Rijeka and Pula, so about
okay.
halfway between Rijeka and Pula. So I lived there for about a year before coming to US.
So how did that trip or really transition happen between moving to, and you said you moved to Washington State
Yeah.
directly from Croatia? I guess how, well,
Well,
why Washington State yeah.
it's a crazy story, but um, I was a student back in Croatia at that time, right? And I heard the radio commercial about a program for basically student exchange, but it was really a way to allow some students, from Croatia to come to US for a year or so to experience the life in US. And although it was termed as exchange, I don't think anybody was coming to Croatia at that time because Croatia was also considered, very fragile and sensitive, not necessarily a war zone at the time, but very close to the conflict in Bosnia, and ultimately likely that tensions would flare at some point. So I, I heard a commercial or advertising on the radio. I could not get it on my head. So after like 2 weeks or so, I actually called the radio station to get all the details and whatnot, and found the contact, and the contest, for recruiting students was still running, luckily, and I applied. So, and from there, a lot of interesting circumstances had to happen,
Mhm.
but
So
ultimately,
you end up
yeah,
in high school, or was that in college when you
it was high
came?
school. So I was still,
High school.
I guess I came to US my junior year in high school.
Okay. And then you finished high school in Washington State, and you enrolled from there to university.
Not quite that simple. So I did finish high school, um, and at the time I was living with a host family, great family, Ron and Nancy Freeman. They have definitely been very important part of my life ever since. But after finishing high school, I moved out, started working, and then started attending community college. And I don't know if you know, but community college typically a much much cheaper, to attend, much easier to get into, not necessarily a lot of exams and whatnot. And I did 2 years of community college
Okay.
while working basically full time, and then I transferred to University of Washington, what would have been my junior year.
Okay. And did you study? So I'm guessing you studied computer science or engineering at the University of Washington.
Yes, so I actually,
And
again, another interesting story, but when I was at community college, they required me to take a foreign language. And although I'm native speaker of a different language, that was not sufficient. So in order to get my associate degree, I had to take a foreign language. And at the time they had French, Spanish, and Japanese. And being
okay.
from Europe, I thought like it would be most interesting, most exciting to start studying Japanese. And that's how
Wow.
I got into it. So I had taken, I think I had to take like a couple quarters or a couple semesters, whatever. So I started studying Japanese language, got kind of interested in Japanese culture. So when I uh, transferred to University of Washington, I actually, what was supposed to be a 2 to 3 year program ended up being a 4 year program for myself, because I did 1 year exchange in Japan,
Okay.
a student exchange in Japan. And then at the end of it, I ended up triple majoring. So it,
Oh wow. So what was the
Bachelor of
triple
Science,
major?
in Computer Science, and then Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics and Bachelor of Arts in Japanese.
Oh wow. So just for some of us that do not know, where exactly is University of Washington?
University of Washington is in Seattle.
In
So
Seattle. Okay.
it's the biggest, probably best known, most recognized school in Washington State, in Seattle.
So okay. So is there a Japanese community in Seattle, or while you were studying, basically, did you have any exposure to Japanese culture in Seattle, or was that your first experience when you did your exchange program in Japan?
Um, so I actually, while at the community college, once I started studying Japanese, I actually found a Japanese roommate, and I was roommate with him for almost 2 years, I would say.
Okay.
And a Japanese guy from just north of Tokyo. Um, and we lived together. He was obviously a very fluent English speaker at the time, and most of our interaction was in English, but I definitely got more exposure to Japanese culture, including the foods and kind of people interactions and stuff, and I always found it very fascinating. And that was one of the reasons, when I learned that the University of Washington has an exchange program. I applied for it, and moved on from there.
Interesting. So you speak Croatian, Japanese, and English, and do you see or find any similarity in the languages at all? I mean, obviously they have different script, maybe different uh,
So I
syntax
mean,
overall, but
they are all, I mean, they're different language groups, right? So they're kind of as
uh,
different as they could be, while
okay,
still being spoken by a large number of humans. But I always found Japanese not to be as difficult as most American English speakers would think of it, because they have a lot of grammatical constructs which are very similar to
okay,
Croatian, namely case markers and ability to uh, basically flip words in sense to some extent. Not directly comparable to Slavic languages like Croatian, but definitely enough to for us to be able to pick up on the grammar and use it effectively. The hardest part
interesting.
about Japanese really is the the writing system, which is a little bit
Okay.
fairly complex, should I say, with
Mhm.
several different scripts used sometimes interchangeably, sometimes just in combination, kind of making it hard to get like a full command of the language. But like the speaking is fairly straightforward. The syllable structure and grammar to some extent is fairly straightforward with a few exceptions. And then biggest problem for foreigners is really use of honorifics and polite language, which kind of makes it hard. But again, these are concepts that exist in Croatian, so not as strange as from as for say an American speaker, American English speaker who's not used to them or has never seen them, experienced them before.
So for some of us software engineers, I was always wondering, how. So obviously, like for example, if you take something like JavaScript or Python, is it to a certain extent customized, or how do Japanese program? How do they write software?
So programming languages are the same, right? And some of them like Ruby obviously have a lot of roots and influence from Japanese creators. But the part that is difficult and different is that the characters of the script are typically multi-byte characters, and traditionally they would be 2-byte characters, but with establishment and popularity of Unicode and UTF-8 in particular, most likely there are 2 to 3 characters, and programming languages and all the file reading writing operations need to support operations on multi-byte characters, and this requires
Okay.
some adjustment, but ultimately there is fairly good support in libraries and tooling to support it now.
Okay.
Back in the day, in 20 years ago, when my first exchange program was happening, there was a lot of confusion and issues with emails, sending emails, because that encoding had to be changed, and UTF was not prominent at that time. So, Japanese people would be using, say, EUCJP to compose it. Then we have to be encoded into some MIME encoding, and then converted into whatever character the reader can interpret. Sometimes it'd be EUCJP, or sometimes it'd be something different. So there was definitely possibilities and room for characters garbling, and to the extent that UTF-8 has become prominent, things have become much more stable and simplified, and now it's really not a problem. You can read and write Japanese from any device, basically, from your Android phone, Mac OS, Windows, obviously. So it's definitely come a long way.
Very interesting. I was always curious about that. So let's go back to the university days. So you are finishing or graduating from University of Washington. You have 3 degrees. Finished your schooling, and then where do you go from there?
So while in my last year at university, I actually started doing various part-time jobs, and I started working for a company called GoToNet. There was a Seattle-based .com company. They were responsible for Metacrawler. I don't know if you remember those days, but that
Yeah,
was
I
one
do
of
remember
the
GoToNet too, actually, vaguely, but I do remember that. That's a unique name.
and they did kind of the meta search engine, before it was a thing, before Google has established itself as a leader. And I after working for them part-time for a couple quarters, I believe, I started working full-time when I graduated. So it was a great environment. We had office at Pier 61 or something, basically on the water in Seattle,
Okay.
Puget Sound. Very nice, convenient, like at the edge of downtown, and lots of very smart people working there, um, making making improvements on search and various other fields that they were tackling, including I think they had like a free web hosting framework that was also quite popular. And yeah, it was a very cool job to get just out of uni.
What happened with them? Were they acquired?
They were acquired by Infosys or something. So I actually don't remember the details. I remember um, that in spring of 2000, so after graduating, I really wanted to go back to Japan. I wanted to go back to the laboratory where I did my exchange program. And that's ultimately where I did my master's and PhD with
Okay.
Professor Hozumi Tanaka, who he was one of the prominent leaders in Japanese kind of computing, natural language processing community. And yeah, and I really want to get back there. So while I was working, I applied, and ultimately I got a Mombusho Japanese government scholarship that basically paid for most of the expenses of my master's and PhD. So I quit GoToNet uh, basically just the same week that they announced that they were being acquired by Infosys.
And what
At
years
that
was this?
time, this was in 2000. I think it was like uh, September 2000 or something.
So it was just like at the kind of height, or
Just
basically
yep,
that's
just
when the
behind.
dot-com bubble burst, because
Yep.
it burst in March
So
approximately.
it burst like a few months after. I remember, at the time
Mhm.
on paper it looked like I was leaving a lot of money behind because my
Yeah.
options have ballooned, over just like a year or so uh, to very significant amount. But nonetheless, I really wanted to continue my education, go back to Japan. So I decided to forego that, and ultimately it turned out to be a wise decision because uh, GoToNet and Infosys stock they they tumbled, when with the dot-com crash, and they never really recovered. So
So
I did
you
not
did
lose a
you
lot of sleep
study
about it.
uh, did you study at University of Washington NLP, or is that something that you found interesting while you're at GoToNet?
So NLP, I got introduced with NLP during my exchange program in Japan. So at the University of Washington, I was studying general computer science. So a lot of things that you would expect, typical computer science course, algorithm, data
Yeah.
structures, various types of applications, system design, whatnot.
What programming languages
But
were prevalent back then, or at least that on in the university setting?
um, so well, one of the courses was programming languages. So I've done like Lisp and Prolog and uh, Java as well as ML. Um, and ML as a meta language, it's basically a functional language very similar to Lisp, or kind of similar to Lisp, should I say? Um,
Okay.
and that was the most. And then obviously C++. Yeah, C++ was also big, and in some courses C. But as I did some of the introductory courses at my community college, I actually did that in Pascal, which
Oh
which
wow.
was already to some extent phased out at the University of Washington. When I went to Japan, I went to Tokyo Institute of Technology, and again to lab of uh, Professor Hozumi Tanaka, and most of the work I did there was using Perl,
Okay.
and Perl was a language of choice for natural language processing at the time. Had a very nice libraries for handling multi-character languages, including regular expressions, and that's really made it easier and nicer for use with natural language processing. So that's kind of how I got my first exposure to Perl, and then all the work I did from my master's and PhD was combination of Perl and some data stores like MySQL and Postgres sometimes.
So did you? I'm guessing so. That sort of your interest in NLP happened afterwards, but sounds to me at least that your Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics was helpful in your further education and PhD work.
It is. So I mean, I was always interested in languages, and I've started learning Japanese before. I had my experiences also learning Italian when I was in Croatia, um, German in high school in Seattle, and then Spanish and Portuguese after graduating. So I always had that desire to learn, languages and talk to people in the language of choice. I always like traveling, so that's always been a hobby of mine, if not favorite pastime. And studying linguistics is really helpful because kind of helps you understand basic mechanics and gives you idea of how things work. So you're not asking questions like why do they say it like this. It's ultimately it's not the best question to ask when trying to learn a language, and getting some kind of understanding of grammar and syntax and morphology really kind of helps to form generalizations and patterns in your head, which makes it easier to learn new languages. So it's true for programming languages also, but much more so for human languages.
And you finished your PhD in Tokyo in Japan. How long did it take you to get the PhD?
So it took me 4.5 years to get my master's. So 2.5 years for PhD and 2 years for the master's. And typically that takes about 5 years. But I was lucky enough or fortunate enough that I got my publications, which were kind of the basic requirements for getting PhD, getting publications at renowned conferences and journals in time. And I was able to graduate in 4.5 years end to end.
And so I'm assuming this was your master's and PhD were in Japanese, not in English, but purely Japanese.
Actually, no. So the publications, I only have one publication written in Japanese, and I have to admit, my professor put a lot of effort in that to make it kind of palatable and consumable to Japanese readers. Most other publications, all other publications I did were in English, and it is now the norm that most international conferences are, fairly English centric, and that has helped me. I did do defense of my master's and my PhD in Japanese, but the slides were all in English. So kind of I speak Japanese, but all the material is in English. So it was
Okay.
definitely interesting dynamic, and that's how typically people would do it in Japan. Some Japanese people would have the slides and everything in Japanese, but many of them would have it in English because all the publications that kind of counted toward PhD would be in English.
Got it. And once you graduated, what was your career move? What happened next for you?
Um, that's another kind of interesting, funny story. But just as I was completing my PhD, Google was opening their office in Japan, in Tokyo, and I get an invite from my professor they were recruiting, and they had an open office. And at the time, I knew what Google was and I knew what they were doing, but ultimately I perceived it as a little bit eccentric, company, California-based startup where people come to work in flip-flops and bring dogs to work, which was very different from the environment in Japan, especially in like prominent companies in Japan, like Sony and NTT and whatnot, where a lot of interesting natural language processing, machine translation research was happening. So I was mostly curious at that time, but ultimately I did send my application in, and I visited that open office, and that really is when I got really excited about Google, and I was very excited. There was I'm not sure if you know who Rob Pike is, but
I'm
uh,
not
he,
sure.
he he's one of the kind of famous language authors. He's behind Go language at Google. He's
Oh,
also
okay.
was one of the chief contributors to Sozol, which is another kind of Google internal language. Before that, Awk, and he was with Ken Thompson when UTF-8 was conceived. So he's a very prominent figure, I would say. And I remember him talking about how he got his scripts that were running for months at a time at on-prem computers, getting them running on Google Cloud on hundreds and thousands of machines, and getting them down from like months to hours in runtime. And
Wow.
during my PhD, I definitely had scripts that were running for days and weeks at a time. So I was like, yes, that's what I need. I want to get my scripts to run in hours. That would be so great. And that was one of the best, experiences when I joined Google. When I wrote my first, scripts, I was able to run all of the web, the complete like web index, which was like, maybe 1.5 terabytes at a time, run it on like 10,000 machines and get my program to complete within an hour. It was like so exciting. So,
So this was in you were interviewing for Google Japan, or were you in Mountain View?
um, so I started my interview process in Japan, and I did like several interviews in Japan. I interviewed with the office directors at the time, and one kind of visitor from US, but then they flew me to Mountain View. So I spent almost a week in Mountain View. I had 2 more full days of interviews. So I talked to like 10, 12 or so people.
Wow.
Uh, interviews, very very technical, all hands-on interviews. A lot of coding, problem solving. Um,
So was
not so
it
many
was it
riddles, contrary to like popular myths, not so many riddles, but a lot of
Mhm.
interesting technical questions and a lot of time spent in interviews. And then I
So
got an offer.
was the interview process for you in Japanese and English, or
So two of my whatever 12 interviews were in Japanese, and those were the two native Japanese speakers. Most interviews in US were, English speakers. Some of them were not native, but all US based, and they were all in English. But basically, the first person I talked to, he was the only one that was really tasked with checking whether my Japanese was up to par. And given that I have my proficiency level 1 um, rating, and that I have been speaking and working in Japanese for several years before that, it was not a big problem.
and so you got an offer, and which year or was this, and when did you start working for Google?
So I got my offer. I can't remember exactly the month, but it's probably January of 2005. So it was before I officially graduated. I mean, at the time, my defense was done, so it was clear that I would be graduating in March or so, end of the school year. But because I needed a work visa in Japan, I was not able to start right away. So I actually started up towards the end of May, I believe 20th of May in 2005. So that was, 6, 7 months after Google went IPO. And
Okay.
some said it was frustrating because I started like a couple months later because of the work visa that I needed to get from Japanese government. And in that time, Google stock went up from $120 to $185 or whatever, right? So uh, it was like, just let me get in, because as you know, all the option prices and stuff, they get locked in on the day you start working. Not Does not depend on the offer or anything else. So
So then, yeah, you started Google. I mean, even though it went public back then, it was relatively speaking still a smaller company compared to what it is today. You start working in Tokyo for Google Japan, right? Or did you
yep,
start
yep.
here
So I was
reporting?
basically, I was the number 3 engineer hired in Japan, and offices were very small at the time. It was so small that I only worked from Tokyo office for one day, and then they flew me to US, and I worked from US for next 3 months, and all the kind of training and assimilation happened in US. And after that period completed, I went back to Japan and started working from Japan office. Although I was always employee of Google Japan, so I was getting paid in yen, not dollars. But I spent
Okay.
probably throughout my life at Google, I spent probably a good 1/4 of my time in US, although I was based in Japan.
Did you, through your early experience at Google, did you meet or did you see or run into Larry Page and Sergey Brin? Did you have any exposure?
Uh, yes, I mean I've had many or multiple meetings with both of them. Um, with Sergey more so early days when he was still involved in search discussions, and I definitely remember meetings where we were talking about how to tokenize queries and similar thing for Google search. Larry, I've met him at the later point, when he became CEO the second time around. I believe it was like 2011. At that time, I was the search lead in Tokyo office. So I was a manager of a large team, 50 plus people. And, whenever he would visit Japan, we would have meetings and discussions and whatnot. So they were very hands-on. I also had experiences with Eric Schmidt while he was CEO, as well as various Eng leadership guys, Alan Eustace and others that were prominent leaders inside the Google organization. It was definitely uh, very accessible and easy. And as you probably know, at that time, Google still had TGIF every Friday, and later moved to Thursday, would have company-wide meetings that would be hosted by Larry and Sergey. So definitely significant exposure to the leadership.
Very cool. And so you spent, once you joined Google, you spent about 12 years working directly for Google.
Yes, so I spent 8 years in Japan and then 4 years in US. So after
What are
after yeah.
what are some of the, I guess, some of the, you mentioned some of the stuff that you were the lead for Google search in Japan, but what are some of the, I guess, more interesting stuff that you worked on that you can share with us? Or what are
um,
some of your favorites, I should say?
well, so one of my favorites is I'm probably one of the very few people who can say that they have implemented their PhD in Google search algorithm, and that's definitely one of my proud moments when I was able to do that. But basically, when I did my PhD, I had developed an algorithm to extract translations of people names and terms that are not in dictionaries from corpora, and I did an implementation which allowed Google to do that from anchors, basically web links, and launched it with very good positive results, and that was ultimately what led to one of my earlier promotions. So that was very, very cool. But I worked on Google spelling, and primarily on spelling correction for non English, non-alphabet script languages. But I also did the spelling for Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian, I believe, uh, Macedonian, a couple other languages we launched back then, where I was doing that as a 20% project, whereas the Japanese spell correction was like my full-time project. So those were some of the cool ones. I also worked in ads for several years, and there I was implementing a new advertising product based on feeds for knowledge base and entities like movies and event tickets and stuff that grew fairly quickly to about half a billion in revenue. It's definitely interesting. And then my last uh, couple years, I was leading a cloud machine intelligence group, which was tasked with taking a Google internal algorithms know-how and turning them into Google Cloud product. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with AutoML line of products that Google offers, but AutoML
Yeah,
Vision is the first
definitely.
one. They were started by me and launched, beta launched, while I was still at Google, and then from there, obviously I left Google and other people carried on. Um, Hey, Google was a great company to work for. Lots of smart people, a lot of resources. Compute was never a problem. Data, to a large extent, was never a problem, and it was definitely a good experience. And I wouldn't be where I am now if I did not learn a lot of things
That's
during my time
great.
there.
So you at one point made a decision, you had enough at Google, or maybe you want to have some kind of a change. And then how did you decide to co-found Agent IQ? Was that something maybe that was born through your research in the past, your PhD work, or is this something that you sort of stumbled upon through different ventures?
Um, that's a great question. So, I mean, at some point, Google grew to be a very big company and became more bureaucratic, and to some extent there was a lot of change in structure, always trying to optimize things at a high level, which was causing some frustration for me. I liked doing new things, pushing new products, and these are typically products that would get affected by reorgs. So my VP would change fairly often, more often than I would like. And then that was kind of one of the reasons why I was getting increasingly frustrated at Google. So I wanted to go to a place where I would be more in control of the success of the product, not necessarily whether certain people or organizations liked it, but whether the market liked it. And what better place to do that than in a startup that is dependent on paying customer base and competing in a very aggressive and non-forgiving environment with other similar startups and incumbent companies. But it was definitely exciting. My co-founder I met through some mutual acquaintances and stuff, and and ultimately we agreed on the vision of helping the end customers, making it more seamless for them, using AI to remove friction and making customer service more accessible. And from there, one thing led to another.
Got it. Did you go through an incubator initially, or were you able to, get some angel money in place to start the whole operation? I guess, what did the beginning of Agent IQ look like?
Yeah, so my co-founder really he's a serial entrepreneur, so he had some connections, and he was instrumental in getting things off the ground. I came in again as a technical CTO, as a technical lead, and was responsible for building the product out. Where he's the one had spent most of the time thinking about funding and go to market. Um, in early 2018, he left the company, and I stepped up, and at that time is when we went from kind of vertical agnostic approach to a very financial institution centric approach. And because I really felt that we needed to focus on a specific market and show that we can operate within a specific segment of a specific market before trying to be everything for everybody. And ultimately that has helped us, because it is very hard to compete when you're not focused, and you're getting distracted and trying to chase very different use cases and applications to support different verticals. So focusing and to some extent reducing our market size has really helped us, because through that we were able to get some clarity and get appropriate partnership and appropriate people to kind of join the company. Um, and one instrumental hire was Soren Bested, who's our CRO right now, who had an excellent uh, background working with the financial institutions and helping them innovate in the mobile payment solutions, and who has spent a couple years before joining AgentIQ developing a prototype solution in collaboration with Bank, one of the uh, influencer banks in a small mid-size community regional bank segment of financial institutions. So we joined forces in 2018, and from there to resolve and focus, we were able to make those initial sales and grow our market to where we are now.
So, to all the co-founders or founders of different companies and startups that are kind of maybe at the early stage, like, what would be your word of advice
Um,
based on your experience?
so I think the most important thing is, things never go the way you expect them to go, either for good or for bad. It's never as good as you hope it will be. It's never as bad as you fear it will be. And most important characteristic in my mind is really grit or perseverance. Basically, not giving up in face of ever-changing situation, highs and lows, and unpredictability. And that is the most important aspect that helps convince the VCs. It also helps motivate the employees, and ultimately potential customers, clients and customers, and really is imperative in in building a business, because nothing is really as it was kind of designed as we thought it would be. But with through perseverance and grit, we were able to push the company forward, and And we still have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful that we will become on top and really build out a new category of service, a personalized digital service, what is going to have impact way beyond, what I expected and what AgentIQ was kind of started to do. So it is important to just keep going.
So talk about grit and perseverance. One of the trademarks of some of the more successful, at least technology startups, is to know and execute a pivot. Did you guys at any point since you started Agent IQ have to pivot in any sense of it?
Yes, very much so. As I mentioned, initially we started as a AI boosted customer service platform, so it was vertical agnostic, and the value add was to some extent um, something that there's a bunch of other startups trying to execute, again through pragmatic use of AI and system design that I've learned at Google, and several other people that were working with me to build the framework in. We had some advantages, but it was a very competitive market. But what I realized talking to prospects and clients is there was a bigger missing piece out there, and that is the ability to have establish and maintain relationships between customers and their institutions, financial institutions in our case. But basically, a lot of frustration that you know uh, people experience when dealing with Comcasts and telcos and financial institutions is really about losing context, having to start over, having to repeat yourself, having to deal with that friction. That's a loss of time both for the customer but also for the institution. And through introspection and through various interviews and discussions we had with our clients and prospects, we realized this is the value add, and we modified our product, we pivoted to reduce our scope from various verticals to financial institutions, specifically basically we became a fintech, and we added all the elements of building and maintaining a relationship into our platform. And this really formed the basis of what our product is now, and what ultimately I talk about when I say about developing a new category, the personalized digital service.
So one kind of question in closing is to all the young engineers, entrepreneurs. You obviously have a very rich experience and a rich career. What will be your word of advice to maybe some of the either college students or high school students that are getting into programming, maybe have ideas to start or have an idea that they want to build a product around? Or would your advice be to get into the entrepreneurial waters right away, or is it maybe better to get some experience like you did with some well-established, uh, progressive company like Google? What would be your word of advice?
It's a great question, and I think I would recommend people to get some real work experience uh, before really indulging in the entrepreneurial um, path. That can be beneficial, financially. It's definitely easier for me to be an entrepreneur now because I know uh, ultimately my wife and kids will not go hungry, even if something bad happens to the company, right? Even if we are run out of money at some point, we still have a somewhat of a cushion in place that really makes it easier to push forward, even when there are more interesting and financially attractive options out there. The reality is, I'd be making much more money if I was still at Google or if I moved on to Facebook or Apple or whatever other companies is coming to be an IPO this year. But I do think the most important aspect is really to not be afraid to try. Like a lot of things, a lot of turning points. I did things that not a lot of people would have done. Coming back to my story about calling a radio station to get information about an ad that I heard a week ago. That's not very common, but I just didn't want to give up, and I wanted to try to see what the outcome would be, and it turned out to be probably the biggest turning point in my life. When I came to US, got exposed to Seattle computer center of the world at that time because of Microsoft, and it has really had a profound impact on my career. Similar thing, going to Japan, there's definitely points where um, it didn't seem plausible that I would get a scholarship, or get like some funding to do my master's and PhD. But ultimately, I just tried. I did it. I applied. I went through the process and applied for more than one, scholarship, and ultimately I got one that turned out to be very good for me. So I do think that is the important mindset to have, not necessarily to worry about mitigating risk and not experiencing loss or detours in life, so to say, but to try new things and push new envelopes and really uh, embark on things that majority of people would not do. And that's ultimately what might yield the biggest impact and might be biggest turning points in your life. But unless you try, unless you give it some effort, you will never know. And that is the worst outcome if you just give up before even trying. So I guess that would be my
Well,
advice.
thank you. I think that's a great advice. Thank you for being the guest on Anablock podcast. You have a absolutely amazing background, amazing professional experience and career, and I definitely wish you all the best with Agent IQ and with everything else. Thanks again for being the guest.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and definitely enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Slaven, thank you for being on Anablock podcast. Slaven is the CEO and president of Agent IQ. Slaven, what is Agent IQ and what do you guys do?
Thanks for having me here, and really appreciate the opportunity. And Agent IQ mission is really to make it easier for customers to engage with their financial institutions, while enabling financial institutions to deepen relationships with their customers and get to know each and every one of their customers. I'm sure you've had experiences where you called your bank and you had to deal with the IVR system, where you have to press a lot of buttons, input a lot of data, and at some point you're pressing zero and just saying like, operator, let me talk to a human, right? And even when you start talking to human, then you have to answer repetitive questions. What's my name? What is my account number? What's my social security number? What is the name of my pet goldfish? Bunch of questions. And only after answering all those questions can you actually start asking your questions. And typically, it's not the first person that resolves it. So you have to get transferred again. You have to answer similar questions. And God forbid that the call drops because you start from zero. All the context is lost and you have to start from the beginning. So this is clearly a frustrating experience that we are helping improve. And the core of what we're doing is really allowing banks to establish a relationship where a customer gets a primary point of contact, a concierge of sorts, and they can keep engaging with them using asynchronous authenticated messaging. And the context is always preserved. There's no need to repeat yourself. And ultimately, as a customer, you know who's helping you. This is beneficial for financial institutions because they can differentiate themselves by providing high quality, high touch, high tech service to their customers, making it seamless, but also they get the ability to proactively reach out to customers. They don't have to passively wait for requests to come in, but they can proactively follow up and really delight their customers. That is what
Great.
AgentIQ is all about.
Great. Thank you for explaining.